Hello guys, welcome back. It's Masha. Today we're going to be talking all about risotto. I find risotto to be incredibly relaxing to cook. It's a process that really gets you in the zone, and it's almost meditative to watch the rice transform and become more and more creamy as the time goes by. Risotto has a reputation of being a really fussy dish to cook, and even though it does require constant attention, the process and the ingredients couldn't be more modest. And once you get the hang of the technique, you really won't need the recipe again. It's a very, very intuitive and simple process. Today I'll also show you my favorite thing to do with risotto leftovers, which is to make really delicious risotto cakes. And since I'm a plant-based cook, this is going to be a vegan risotto, but I'm going to show you my favorite trick for how to add that creamy, cheesy flavor without cheese. And what I like to do for that is to make a really quick and easy cashew parm. I really like putting it together in my mortar and pestle. You can also use a food processor for this. You would just have to increase the volume of the ingredients. But the reason that I like the mortar and pestle so much is that I can make just a small amount and use it all in the risotto. So to make this cashew parm, I'm gonna add a 1/4 cup of raw cashews to my mortar. And I'm just gonna pound them until they form kind of like a fine dust with a little bit of texture. Alright, so I got the cashews down to a texture that looks really good. They're crumbly with some bigger chunks. Next, I'm gonna add some nutritional yeast. And nutritional yeast is basically just an inactive yeast that has a really deep, savory umami flavor that's a little bit cheesy. So I'm gonna add some to taste. It looks like these yellow flakes, and it's delicious. It's really good on popcorn, and it's just really good in building really deep, savory flavor. I'm also gonna add some sea salt to taste and some freshly ground black pepper and mix it all up. And that's it, we've got our delicious cashew parm. So the reason that this combination of ingredients works is because cashews are very fatty, so they're bringing that fat, and cheese obviously has fat in it, and it brings that creaminess. And then the salt and the nutritional yeast are bringing saltiness and umami, and the black pepper I just really like in there. You can omit it if you're not into that. So with this, you can either follow my recipe or just do it to taste. You can taste little bits and see if it's salty enough. You want it to be pretty salty. Just think of parm, it's a very salty cheese, so we're going for a similar effect. I'm gonna set this aside for now. We're gonna use it in the risotto later. And now we're gonna prep the rest of our ingredients. So first I'm gonna dice up an onion. You can also use leeks in place of the onion. So I would use about 2 leeks, thinly sliced. I'm gonna slice it lengthwise through the root end. Then lengthwise like this. And then into a neat little dice. And you want to dice the onion pretty finely because we kind of want it to melt into the risotto. Next, I'm gonna mince up some garlic. And garlic is crucial in risotto. That combination of onion or leek, garlic, and white wine is so classic and so delicious. So I'm gonna smash to release the skins, then peel and mince. And with risotto, you really want to have all your ingredients at the ready. You don't want to be preparing them while you're making the risotto, just because it is a process that requires your attention. It's not difficult, but it does require some babysitting. And I've prepared a cup of Arborio rice, or you can use any other risotto-friendly rice. And risotto-friendly rice is just a rice that's very starchy. I have some white wine, and white wine just brings complexity and acidity. You could omit the wine and replace it with some other sort of acid like vinegar or lemon juice, and the risotto will still be delicious, but in my experience, nothing really can replace wine in a really simple risotto. It just brings the best kind of complexity. And all of the alcohol cooks off. I also have a pot of vegetable broth heating up on the stovetop. And I made this broth, and I really like using homemade veggie broth for risotto just because it is such a simple recipe, and having a really good broth matters. You could also use store-bought and it'll still taste good, but if you can make your own, I highly recommend. And then aside of these staple ingredients of risotto, you can play around with flavoring it so many different ways. Today I'm gonna flavor my risotto with mushrooms and kale. So I have some shiitake mushrooms here that I already sauteed earlier just to prepare. And I have some stemmed and torn kale leaves at the ready. You can do all kinds of things to flavor your risotto. You can add roasted vegetables, like roasted squash would be really good, or roasted carrots. In the spring, risotto is really good with peas and asparagus. You can basically add any seasonal vegetables to it. More dense veggies like squashes need to be pre-cooked, so I would usually roast them first and then add them to the risotto. But with more tender and water-rich vegetables like peas and asparagus, I would just add them directly to the risotto and cook them in the risotto. And yeah, we're ready to start cooking. So I'm heating up my large skillet over a medium heat. And then once the skillet is preheated, I'm gonna add plenty of olive oil to coat the bottom of the pan. Let that warm up. And then I'm gonna add the onion and a pinch of salt. And I'm gonna mix and saute the onion until it's nice and soft and translucent, which is gonna take around 7 to 10 minutes. And this is always the first step to making risotto, is just sauteing an onion until it's nice and soft. Okay, so the onions are looking good. It's been about 10 minutes. And the cues that you're looking for with the onions is for them to look nice and translucent, but not browned. When you test them with your spatula, they should feel pretty soft. So next we're gonna add our garlic. And again, this step will be the same for any kind of risotto that you make. First onion, then garlic, and we add the garlic later just because it cooks much faster than the onion and we don't want it to burn and get bitter. And here we're just gonna mix the garlic in for about 30 seconds, just until it gets nice and fragrant. And now we're gonna add in the rice. And the next step that is also universal for risotto is to toast the rice a little bit. So just for a few minutes, we're gonna keep stirring the rice and letting it toast. And it needs to be toasted to a point where it looks nice and translucent. And this step is very important because it prepares the rice for properly and slowly absorbing the broth and not bursting open. So it's been around 5 minutes. If you look closely at the grains of rice, you're gonna see that they're translucent on the outside with a little bit of white on the inside. We don't want to toast it to the point where it's browning at all. And once the rice is nice and toasted, we are gonna add the wine. So this is a white wine. I like using a dry white wine. And you want it to make the sound. You want the pan to be hot enough for it to make this sizzling sound. This immediately makes the kitchen smell amazing. And we're just gonna let the wine come to a simmer, and we're gonna let the rice absorb the wine almost completely, stirring it. And we're ready for the next step, which is adding the hot broth. Got my hot broth here, and I'm just gonna add 1 ladleful of it to the risotto. And we're gonna mix this broth in with the rice and let it come up to a simmer, and then let it simmer very gently until the rice absorbs all of the broth, and then we're gonna add more. And the amount of broth that you wanna add is about a ladleful, or you just wanna barely cover the rice. And then while the rice is doing the work of absorbing the broth, you wanna keep it moving. And the stirring motion, what risotto is kind of notorious for, and why it needs so much babysitting. The stirring helps the rice develop its starches, which is what makes the final product really nice and creamy. So it's been maybe like 2 minutes or so, and the rice has absorbed all of the broth that I added. So now it's time to add more. And the reason that we're adding hot broth is just because we don't want to stall the cooking. If we were to add cold broth in here, it would stall the cooking process and it would need to come back up to a simmer, which would take a really long time and just, it wouldn't flow very smoothly. And I'm gonna keep stirring and letting it absorb into the rice. And this is basically the whole risotto cooking process. Just keep doing this, waiting for the broth to absorb, then adding more broth, basically until the rice is a nice texture. And the texture that you're looking for in the rice is cooked through, but a little bit al dente, so with a little bit of a bite. And this whole dance of adding the broth and letting it absorb usually takes somewhere around 25 to 30 minutes, but just keep tasting, keep absorbing your rice. It's gonna magically start getting much more creamy and cooked, and it's really just a very beautiful process. Okay, so I'm at the 4th addition of broth, which is when I usually like to add any dark leafy greens if I'm using any. So I'm gonna add my kale now. And this just allows some time for the kale to wilt down and cook because it's a sturdier green. If I was adding spinach or something like that, I would add it at the very end just because spinach doesn't need as much time as kale does. So I'm just gonna slowly work it in, and it's gonna wilt and cook nicely while we finish cooking the rice. And then a note on salting the risotto, just consider the kind of broth that you're using. I'm using homemade veggie broth, which is very lightly salted. So in this case, I have been adding little pinches of salt throughout. If you're using a store-bought broth, especially if it's not like the low sodium kind, you might not even need salt. You can always taste the risotto at the end and add a little more salt if needed. But also something to consider is that we're gonna be adding that cashew parm, and that's already salted. Okay, so we're reaching the end here. It's been about 30 minutes. You can see that the kale is nice and wilted, and now I'm gonna add those shiitake mushrooms that I already pre-cooked. And I'm gonna mix them in and just let them warm through. And now I'm gonna add most of the cashew parm, leaving some of it for garnishing. Gonna mix that in. And this is just gonna give us more creaminess, more saltiness, and umami. And that's it, our risotto is ready. So as long as you follow these very basic steps of first sauteing the onion, then adding garlic and toasting the rice a little bit, then adding the wine, and then doing the broth dance of adding some broth, letting it absorb, and adding more, and then just make it your own with whatever other additions you'd like. As long as you follow these basic steps, you won't ever need a strict recipe for risotto. Just follow your intuition and follow the cues, and you'll end up with really delicious, creamy risotto every time. And then to serve, I'm gonna spoon some of the risotto into the middle of my plate, and then just shake the plate a little bit for the risotto to spread out. I'm gonna garnish it with some of that cashew parm. It's so good. The rice is creamy with a little bit of that al dente bite. And then I love adding kale and mushrooms. I think it's a really good combo. I think it's really nice for winter. And now I'll quickly show you my favorite thing to do with leftover risotto, which is to make risotto cakes. When you bake risotto, the rice on the outside, on the edges, gets really crispy, and they're just so delicious. And just a perfect way to use up risotto. I am preheating the oven to 425F. I have a parchment-lined baking sheet here handy, and I've been cooling my risotto in the fridge in like a thin layer. Ideally, this would be leftover risotto that's already been in the fridge overnight or longer, and when risotto has been refrigerated for a while, it comes together really easily and makes really nice cakes. I'm just gonna transfer this risotto to a bowl to make it easier to mix and scoop. And all I'm gonna add is some breadcrumbs. So the breadcrumbs will help the cakes be even more crispy, and they help them come together a little more. So I just have panko. That's what I have on hand. You can use any breadcrumbs that you like. And I always eyeball the amount that I add, but it's about a third of the amount of the risotto that I add of the breadcrumbs. But I basically just add enough breadcrumbs so that the consistency feels like the cakes will come together and stay together. And I'm just gonna mix in the breadcrumbs. Now I'm gonna take a 1/4 cup measure and measure out the risotto. And then I'm gonna transfer this to the baking sheet. And then just keep going like that. And then once we have these little measured out mounds, we are gonna take a spoon and flatten them out into little cakes. And it's okay if you get scraggly uneven edges, it's even better because they'll get nice and crispy. And then I usually brush these guys with oil just to encourage that crispiness, But today I'm gonna experiment and see how they do without any oil. But if you'd like to do it, normally I brush one side, then after I flip them, I brush the other side as well with some olive oil. So these are going into the 425-degree oven for 20 minutes. And then after the 20 minutes, flip the cakes, put them back in the oven for another 20 minutes, and they're done. They're so good, crispy on the outside, molten inside. As a bonus, try serving them with some really good sauce. I personally love them with a creamy mustard maple sauce. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it demystified risotto for anybody who needed it. I personally used to be really afraid of cooking risotto until I actually tried it and realized that it's a super simple process and really meditative and kind of fun. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.